Hi, this is part 41 of my preparation for NSE4 exam, and this part is about monitoring and troubleshooting high availability clusters. So switching to the command line interface of another member. We can switch using FortiGate command line interface. We connect to command line interface of any other members using command execute HA manage, and then we need to indicate member ID and then indicate admin username. So we do it by using execute HA manage command to connect to the other member. For example, when we connect to the cluster over SSH secure shell using any of the cluster virtual IP addresses, we connect to the primary member. So if then we want to connect to another member, we can use execute HA manage command to access its command line interface. This command requires us to indicate ID of the member we want to connect and the username that we will use to log in. To get the list of member IDs, we just put at the end of this command execute HA manage, we put question mark, and note that CLI connection is made over SSH and Ethernet frames type 0x8893. FortiGate establishes a secure SSH session to the member over the heartbeat interface. Next, force a permanent secondary role on the primary. We can set the primary FortiGate to have a permanent secondary role using the command execute HA failover set. When we do this, the failover occurs and the former primary member remains as a secondary member permanently. It's regardless of the status of other members in the cluster. That is, the impacted member never takes over the cluster even if it's the best candidate for the primary role. But we can revert this using the command execute HA failover unset command. Note that we should set the primary member to a permanent secondary role for testing, troubleshooting, and demonstration purposes only. And we will not use it in production networks. It's not recommended for production networks. Use only for purposes such as testing, demonstration, and troubleshooting. Next, connect to any member directly. There are two ways to do that. When we connect to a cluster using any of its virtual IP addresses, we always connect to the primary FortiGate. We can then switch to the command line interface of any member in the cluster by using the execute HA manage command. But what if we want to access the graphical user interface of a secondary member? Or what if we want to pull data from it using SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol? For this, we need to find a way to access each member directly, regardless of its role in the cluster. And FortiGate provides two ways for the administrator to connect to this member directly, no matter what the member role is. The reserved high availability management interface is out of band option. We can configure up to 4 dedicated management interfaces, and we can assign them a unique address on each member. We can then use a unique address assigned to each member to connect them directly. We can also instruct FortiGate to use the dedicated management interface for some outbound management services, such as SNMP traps, logs, and authentication requests. Alternatively, we can configure in-band high availability management, and in-band high availability management interface uses any user traffic interface. It's not a dedicated interface. We can, it is for local in and local out traffic. And then we connect to this member using that unique management address. If we have unused interfaces, then it's generally more convenient to use a reserved high availability management interface, because the user and management traffic don't have to compete. Many FortiGate models come with management interface, so we can use it for this purpose. Also, the routing information for the reserved high availability management interface is placed in a separate routing table, which means that we don't see the interface routes and segmentation between data and management traffic. So for reserved high availability management interface, configuration is as follows. Config system HA, then set HA management HA MGMT status enable, then config HA MGMT interfaces, then edit 1, set interface port 10, set gateway, put IP address of the gateway. Next, then end, and then config system interface, edit, then we put interface, for example, port 10, set IP, then we put IP address and its subnet mask. Then set allowance ping HTTP SSH SNMP. Next, end. The characteristics of reserved HA management interface: first, that it is out of band. Second, you can use up to 4 dedicated interfaces. It is for local in traffic and some local out traffic. There is separate routing tables, And the second method, which is in-band method, in-band management interface. First, it's for local in and for local out traffic, and there is a shared routing table. In reserved HA management interface, it is a separate routing table. And configuration example of high availability HA management interface, that we first config system interface, edit, then we put interface name, for example port 10 or port 1, set management -IP, then we put IP address and its subnet mask, set a lowestness ping HTTPS, SSH, SNMP, next, and then put end and the end. And note that for both options, in-band reserved in-band HA management interface and reserved HA management interfaces, in both cases we need a configuration to apply on a member which is not synchronized to other members in the cluster. And there is only one part for HA, high availability, left, which is firmware upgrade. For firmware upgrade, when we upgrade high availability cluster, in the same way we do it for standalone FortiGate devices. That is, we can apply the new firmware using graphical user interface firmware upgrade tool. In HA, high availability, this usually means connecting to the primary FortiGate graphical user interface to apply the new firmware. We can also use a command line interface if you prefer it. Also, like on standalone FortiGate devices, the device must reboot to apply the new firmware. But however, by default, members in a cluster are upgraded one at a time to minimize services disruption. And this feature is called uninterruptible upgrade. It's like a graceful upgrade, and it is enabled by default. After the administrator applies the new firmware on the primary FortiGate, uninterruptible upgrade works as follows. Step 1. Primary sends the firmware image to the secondary members using the heartbeat interface. Second step. The secondary devices upgrade their firmware first. If the cluster is operating in active mode, the primary temporarily takes over all traffic. The first secondary that finishes upgrading its firmware takes over the cluster. The former primary becomes a secondary device and upgrades the firmware next. So note that depending on the high availability settings and uptime, the original primary FortiGate, what was before, it changes its status to secondary. And later, if required, we can issue a manual failover. And alternatively, we can enable override setting on the primary FortiGate to ensure that it takes over the cluster again after the device is assigned the high priority. If we want the cluster to upgrade all members at the same time, then we need to disable this setting. So enabling this setting is config system HA set uninterruptible -upgrade enable, and to disable this setting is config system HA set uninterruptible -upgrade status upgrade disable. And just keep in mind that this will result in a service impact during the firmware upgrade. And note that when step 3, first secondary finish, becomes the primary, then high availability mode is active. If it is so, the primary temporarily takes over all the traffic. And the former primary becomes a secondary device and upgrades its firmware. We can enable override setting on the primary to ensure that it takes over a cluster, and after that, when firmware upgrade is completed. Questions. Which member is the heartbeat interface IP address assigned to? 169.254.0.1. To the member with the highest serial number or priority? And the answer is, it is the member is the bit interface IP address 169.254.0.1 is assigned to the member with the highest serial number. And second question, which statement about the firmware upgrade process on high availability cluster is true? The members do not reboot, or you upload the new firmware to the primary FortiGate only? And the correct answer, of course, is that you upload the new firmware to the primary FortiGate only. Thank you.